Thank you. It is great to be back with the New York Academy of Sciences. It has been a long time since our last series. So what can philosophers tell us about the nature of consciousness? That's our big question for this evening. And I should preface this by saying that some scientists really don't think that philosophers have much to say about this or any other subject. The late Stephen Hawking declared philosophy is dead because it has not kept up with modern developments in science. Another physicist, Lawrence Krauss, has said science progresses and philosophy doesn't. When Bill Nye, the science guy, was asked in an interview about certain philosophical ideas about consciousness and the nature of reality, he suggested that philosophy might be a meaningless topic. So when we were putting together this panel, we, of course, invited three philosophers to talk about the nature of consciousness. Now, I should say that our speakers are extremely well-versed in science, and as you'll see, philosophers often disagree with each other, especially on questions about what consciousness is and where it comes from, because these are some of the deepest mysteries there are, and they raise profound questions about the relationship between brain and mind, about the differences or the connections between the physical stuff that we can look at and measure and the immaterial world of what we think and feel. And these questions also have huge implications for how we construct our sense of ourselves and our place in the world. Does my brain make me who I am, or am I more than just the neurons firing inside my skull? Philosophers and scientists, of course, have been debating these questions for centuries, but it's really only in the last few decades, especially with the advent of neuroimaging, that we've had a chance to look inside the brain to get some idea of what's happening in real time. So, what have we learned from this golden age of neuroscience, and what are the questions that science still cannot answer? And we have three very smart people this evening to help us sort out these questions. So let me introduce them. Ned Block is a professor of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience at New York University. Before that, he chaired the philosophy program at MIT. He works in the philosophy of perception and the foundations of neuroscience and cognitive science. He's a past president of the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, and his new book about perception and cognition is titled The Border Between Seeing and Thinking. Philip Goff, fresh off the plane from the UK, is a philosopher at Durham University. His research focuses on how to integrate consciousness into the scientific worldview. He's the author of Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness, and he's just edited a book called Is Consciousness Everywhere? Essays on Panpsychism. He's now working on a new book that explores the middle ground between God and atheism. Rebecca Newberger Goldstein has taught at a number of universities, and she's currently a visiting professor of philosophy at the New College of the Humanities in London. She's the author of 10 books of both fiction and nonfiction. Her novels include The Mind-Body Problem and 36 Arguments for the Existence of God. I have to say, you have the best titles for your books.
Wait, you forgot the subtitle of 36 Arguments.
Oh.
A work of fiction.
A work of fiction, yes. So I did say it was a novel. Her most recent book is Plato at the Googleplex, Why Philosophy Won't Go Away. So welcome, all of you. So Ned, I want to start with you. There has been a flurry of books and journals and conferences about consciousness. The discussion seems to be everywhere. Of course, there has been just a boom of interest and breakthroughs in brain science, especially the efforts to map the neural correlates of consciousness. But the question is, are we much closer now than we were, let's say, 30 years ago to understanding what consciousness actually is?
Well, the 30 years is a good choice, because that's really the beginning of scientific work on consciousness. It started, in my view, with an article by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch in 1990. I think it's called something like Towards a Bio something Theory of Consciousness or something like that. And the 90s, which, as you know, saw the rise of fMRI brain scanning, really was, what Crick and Koch really told us, that people hadn't really quite realized before, was that we could study consciousness by studying the perceptual systems of the animals. And that allowed a lot of techniques that people weren't using before. The 90s also saw the beginning of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, and the 26th annual meeting is going to be held at NYU. Dave Chalmers, who's sitting in the second row, and I are on the steering committee for it. That has been a vehicle for philosophers and scientists to collaborate. In addition, there's been a lot of collaborative efforts between scientists and philosophers, including participation in a lot of grants. But I haven't really...
Right, so I'm going to jump in here because there's a lot of talk about it.
Yeah.
Do we actually know more about consciousness?
What I would say is that we've sharpened the questions. So 30 years ago, there wasn't really any theory of consciousness, or maybe one sort of a theory. Now there are 4 basic cognitive neuroscience theories of consciousness, and partly framed by philosophers. There is the higher order thought theory that says that what it is for a perception to be conscious is for you to have another state about it. There's the global workspace theory, which stems from a 1988 a book by Bernard Bars, but has been developed by some French neuroscientists, notably Stanislas Dehaene. There is the information integration theory, and the one that I like most is what you might call the biological theory. It's a localist theory. But so these views have been sharpened up, and we are now designing experiments to try to test them.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to you, Rebecca. You have been following these issues for many years. How far do you think we've come along in, let's say, the last 30 years?
We've come so far. When I first got involved in these questions, you had to defend the use of the word consciousness. It was really, it was considered flaky to even talk about it, consciousness. And so, it's extraordinary what's happened. I think that we have made, one has to talk about the distinction that again, David Chalmers was the first to put so very well between the easy problems, about which we have made enormous progress. So in mapping the brain and understanding the neuronal substrate of these various functions and knowing what the functions are, and being able to understand how they interact with each other, the functions of consciousness, and the evolutionary explanation for these functions. So from neuroscience, from cognitive science, which is understanding the consciousness in terms of the functions, and evolutionary psychology, the evolutionary reasons for these various functions. Enormous amount we've learned. There is what David had called the heart problem, and that is the problem of why does it feel like something to be going through these functions? Why does it feel like something to have a functioning brain? We've made absolutely no progress on that. And there are those of us who think that we never will.
Okay, Philip, let me turn to you. How far do you think science has taken us to explaining consciousness?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of agreement so far. I think there has been a lot of progress, as Ned says, in all sorts of ways. But more in line with what Rebecca said, I think one thing that I believe really holds us back at the moment is I think many people misunderstand the nature of the problem. It's so often presented as a purely scientific problem. It's gone from being something that wasn't seen as serious science to now being seen as just this purely scientific problem of, the challenge of understanding how brains produce consciousness. And then the thought is we just need to plug away at our standard methods of investigating the brain and we'll crack it. But I would argue that what is at root here is a philosophical rather than a purely scientific problem, what we traditionally called the mind-body problem. And I think until we confront it as a philosophical problem, we're not going to be able to properly move towards a solution. So I think I'm probably a little bit more optimistic than Rebecca, but I think it's almost like we've taken a philosophical problem, labeled it scientific, and then wondered why science isn't solving it. I think we need to appreciate the science is very important, but there are ineliminable philosophical elements here too.
Is consciousness just another word for mind? Do they mean the same thing?
No, I think so. Look, there's lots of different issues going on here. I mean, I think that the fundamental mind-body problem arises because we have two very different ways of accessing objective reality: perception and introspection. So through perception, we access the physical world through our senses, and we've learned how to do that more accurately and precisely through science. Through introspection, we access consciousness via our immediate awareness of our own feelings and experiences. Then the mind-body problem is, how do we bring these two seemingly very different things, consciousness on the one hand, the physical world on the other, how do we bring them together in a single unified theory of reality? And so that's really the core of the mystery. But answering your question, no, there are many aspects of psychology. I think it's undeniable there are many aspects of psychology that don't at least directly correspond to some kind of conscious experience. So, for example, you believe Beijing is the capital of China. Now I've mentioned it, you're explicitly thinking about it. But 5 minutes ago, you weren't thinking about it. But we'd still be happy to say, even when you weren't thinking about it, you believed that Beijing is the capital of China. So it doesn't correspond directly to some kind of conscious experience. However, whether ultimately we can explain beliefs and all aspects of psychology in terms of consciousness is a hotly debated question, but one I would probably ultimately support.
So I think we need to define our terms here. Ned, what is your most basic, simplest definition of what consciousness is?
I don't think consciousness can be directly defined. I think I like to distinguish between what I call phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, where access consciousness is global availability of information. And phenomenal consciousness is often defined as awareness, which is really just a synonym, or the sense of what it's like to have, to smell coffee or see red. But those are just synonyms. So I don't really think it can be defined. I think we know it from our own case.
So explain what you mean by access consciousness, then.
I mean availability of the information in, for example, perception to all the so-called consuming systems of the brain, like working memory, perceptual categorization, decision, thinking, reasoning, reporting. So it's that availability which I think is sometimes when people talk about consciousness, they mean that. So I wrote an article in the 90s distinguishing between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. And I had, interestingly, two opposing kinds of reviews by the referees. Some people said, I understand why phenomenal consciousness is consciousness, but this access thing, why do you call that consciousness? And then the opposite, people said, oh, I see why access consciousness is consciousness, but why this phenomenology stuff, what's that? So I think people just, have a different picture of what the most basic aspect of the mind is. And for some, it's cognition, and for some, it's phenomenal consciousness.
So one of the questions is put on the table here is this fundamental, is this whole subject that we're talking about tonight, the nature of consciousness, and also where it comes from, is it fundamentally a science problem, or is it a philosophical problem. And I think, for a lot of people, they think, oh, it's, neuroscience will figure this out. Maybe physics. You probably have to sort of bring in, physics, maybe quantum physics at some level. And what about philosophy now? Rebecca, you wrote a book called The Mind-Body Problem. Why do we need philosophers to even be talking about this?
Well, that was a novel. I would like to just add to Ned's wonderfully clear explication of these two different kinds of consciousness, or what people mean when they're talking about consciousness. Also self-consciousness, because often people seem to be talking about that. I mean, consciousness can take many objects. We can be conscious of many objects, and we, and maybe some other animals as well, can take the self as an object as well. And often when people talk about consciousness, they're talking about self-consciousness. So I don't know if you would accept that among your...
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but that's different from phenomenal, it's different from access. And
by self-consciousness, you mean self-awareness?
Yeah, ask me, penny for your thoughts, right? And you can turn and look at and describe. You go to an analyst and you're pouring out story of your life. Anyway, but you were asking about science.
So take me into the history of philosophy and how philosophy has dealt with this question, because my impression is that consciousness was not always considered a problem for philosophy. I mean, if you go back to Plato and Aristotle, did they talk about consciousness?
Yeah, that's really extremely interesting, because we do find so many of the basic philosophical questions first being formulated by Plato and Aristotle, but I don't think there is quite this problem for them. Excuse me. I mean, they, not consciousness per se. I mean, Plato had this tripartite theory of the soul, but it was different. There were three different kinds of consciousness that he was concerned with there, with reason, the will, and the passions, the bad passions. And so
when did it become
I think
a
it really comes
philosophical
in the
issue?
17th century. And I think that we had to have a clear enough notion of matter, the scientific notion with the formation of modern science, modern physics, with Galileo particularly, and his notion that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Those who would peruse this great book must first learn the language. And so, so everything that could be expressed mathematically really existed in matter, and everything else was deposited in the mind. So his distinction between primary and secondary properties. So there are the primary properties of matter that are really objective and external and characterize the external world. And then there's, the feel of things, the colors, the smells, the tastes. And that couldn't easily be given a mathematical expression, and it was deposited in the mind. And then you have the problem of, well, how does the mind fit in with the body? And so you have Descartes, a contemporary of Galileo, putting forth something very much like this problem, and of course he asserted Cartesian dualism, that there's the body and there is the immaterial mind, and they somehow interact in the region of the pineal gland. This is when it makes its entry, and Leibniz, Leibniz has an argument that Ned and I were recently talking about that really seems to be, an mechanistic argument that mind just can't be assimilated to the mechanistic conception of matter that was coming into existence and that is almost synonymous with modern physics.
So I want to bring Philip into this discussion because you wrote a book called Galileo's Error. Basically, it's sort of like that's where things went wrong, right?
Yeah, so very similar to what Rebecca's saying, really. I think a key moment in the scientific revolution is Galileo's declaration that mathematics is to be the language of the new science. From now on, science is to have this purely quantitative vocabulary. But I think Galileo appreciated that you can't capture the qualities we encounter and experience in these terms, the redness of a red experience, the smell of coffee, the taste of mint. You can't even articulate these kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative language of neuroscience, for example. So, I mean, I think, to cut a long story short, I think Galileo essentially says, well, if we want a purely mathematical science, we need to put consciousness outside of the domain of science. So in his worldview, there's this division between the domain of science, the physical world with its purely mathematical properties, and consciousness with its qualities in the soul or the animated body. He had a more Aristotelian conception of the soul. So I think this is important because I think many people think, wow, physical science has done so well. Of course, it's going to deal with consciousness. But the irony is that it's done so well since and arguably because Galileo took consciousness outside its domain of inquiry. So the fact that physical science has done really well since we took consciousness out doesn't necessarily give us confidence that it's going to be able to deal with consciousness itself, which is not to say, of course, physical science is hugely important here, but I think we've also got to take the philosophical core here seriously as well.
So Ned, going back to what you were saying when we first started this conversation, that basically the science of consciousness really took off 30 years ago or so with Francis Crick and Christoph Koch. It sounds like you're saying that was the moment maybe when consciousness came back into the field of science. It sort of became a legitimate field of study.
And philosophers have been involved with the science of consciousness from the beginning. And I think especially recently it's been generally recognized both by the scientists and by granting agencies that the techniques that philosophers learn of conceptual clarification and formulating the theories is really valuable for the science of consciousness. And so there are now a lot of joint projects. Dave and I have a $3 million grant from we're two of the three directors of a $3 million grant from the Templeton World Charities Foundation to test the difference between first order theories and higher order theories, the theories that I mentioned that say that you need another state about a state to make it conscious. And so we, together with a bunch of scientists, have formulated experimental tests that we hope will decide between these. It's a so-called adversarial collaboration in which adversaries agree on the kind of thing that might decide between them.
So I want to come back to this question of why do we need philosophers to talk about consciousness? I mean,
so I think it's a mix. I think all these issues on the frontier are a mix of conceptual and empirical issues.
So the philosophers are at the conceptual level, the scientists are at the empirical.
Well, no, I actually think that both are at both levels, but the philosophers have special training in the conceptual part, so that gives us a certain edge there, but sometimes we're wildly off on the conceptual things too. And philosophers increasingly have a fairly good grasp of the empirical stuff too. So it's a collaborative thing. I'm on another grant on free will, funded by some different foundations, which has 7 philosophers and 8 scientists together deciding experiments on the springs of action. And increasingly, this is a thing that that philosophers realize they need to learn the science. And the scientists realize they need some understanding of the philosophical issues the way the things have been discussed in the past. And together they can do better than either separately.
So, Rebecca, I'm guessing that you have things to add to this, but I want to throw in another frame of reference for exploring consciousness, and that's fiction. I mean, you wear these two hats in this very interesting way, and I mean, and I think one could argue that maybe it's in a novel that's where we really can see the expression of consciousness.
Yes, and you're right that I do want to add something to what Ned had said. It seems to me, because I had started out, my original interest in philosophy was in philosophy of physics, and particularly in interpretations of quantum mechanics. And philosophers, I think, play a role in the sciences. It's extremely important for philosophers to if Stephen Hawking was right, that would be a terrible indictment of philosophers, but he was wrong. He was talking to the wrong philosophers. But it's philosophers. One of the things that philosophers are trained to do is to map out sort of the space of possibilities. Given the science, what are the possibilities? And there are often more possibilities than the scientists are aware of. That the science, the empirical science, is telling us something about the world, but what exactly it's telling, what is still possible, that's just not what they're thinking about often. But philosophers are. And another thing that philosophers, I think, are quite interested in doing, that in my experience, scientists sometimes are not as much, is in trying to bring the original intuitions that people have about the mind, consciousness, space, time, causality, individuality, all of these very core ideas. To see, how do they stand up against what the science is telling us now? So, philosophers, I think, have this, share the basic human concern of we're trying to get our bearings in this world, right? Where the hell are we, and what are we, and what are we in relation to the rest of the things? So it's these grand pictures of how do we fit in. Science, to its great credit, it's sort of more narrowly focused.
So, and then bring in what a novelist can do.
What does a novelist do? Tell stories. The reason I turned to so back in the day, when I was thinking about consciousness, and as I said, it was very, very hard to often get people to even take seriously that there was still this real big problem. And I thought that somehow writing a novel about that, because novels are all about what does the world feel like to a character, and novels do an extraordinary thing, which is they give us sometimes the feeling that we're inhabiting a different worldview, a different perspective. If you write a novel, you have this illusion, or whatever it is, to a very great extent. You really feel that you're inhabiting a different subjectivity. And that's, after all, what a character is. A character is a subjectivity, a worldview, a way of being in the world, which is often very different from the way the novelist feels about being in the world. So I thought, well, that would be interesting. But I don't think, it's sometimes been said to me, science deals with the easy problems, but fiction deals with the hard problem. I would love to believe that. It's very flattering as a novelist. I don't think it is at all true. I know that by dipping a Madeleine into a lime-infused tea stirred up a great deal of associations in Marcel, in Proust's great novel, like so many associations that it took 7 volumes to explore them all. But I don't know what it tasted like to dip that Madeleine into the lime-infused tea. Nothing that in a novel could tell me that. Novels are also about the easy problem. Anything that can be expressed in language, really, is about the easy problem. All we can say about the hard problem is there is this what is it like to be-ness, this subjectivity, this qualia choked phenomenology. You all know it because you all have it, but nothing that we can really say in an explanatory way gets at it, and the novel doesn't.
So there's a statement that I've heard from a number of people that when people try to explain what the mind is what the brain does. I've sort of heard that statement a number of times, and I think the thinking behind that among a lot of people is that if you have enough complexity and connectivity in a brain, if you got enough neurons, enough synaptic connections, if it's all wired together in a really complicated way, you get a mind. And, human beings seem to have more connectivity than anything else that we know, the human brain. Philip, how far does that explanation, in your view, take us to explaining what a mind is?
Well, that's one proposal, one philosophical proposal. So as I say, I think we need to think of these as different solutions to the mind-body problem, this philosophical challenge of trying to bring together consciousness and the physical world into a single unified theory of reality. And broadly speaking, there are 3 options. 1, it's the physical world that's fundamental, and consciousness arises from physical processes in the brain. Maybe Ned favors that view. Second option that I prefer, panpsychism, turns that on its head, right? So that's the view that it's consciousness that's fundamental and the physical world arises from more underlying facts about consciousness. And then the third option, dualism, Professor Chalmers is rather partial to, that both consciousness and the physical world are equally fundamental but distinct, and maybe there are special laws of nature connecting the two up. So you asked earlier, why, what the hell are philosophers doing with all this stuff? I mean, crucially, each of those views, at least in certain forms, are empirically equivalent, right? You're not going to have an experiment that in any straightforward way is going to tell you which is the right answer, which shouldn't be surprising because this is a philosophical problem. Just like you're not going to get an experiment that's going to tell you whether the pro-choice position or the pro-life position is the correct view of the ethics of abortion, right? These are philosophical questions. So we can pretend the problem doesn't exist, or we can try and assess these empirically equivalent options and try and adjudicate between them in some way. You asked me what I think of the materialist option. I don't find it that plausible myself.
Okay, so I said at the beginning that philosophers often disagree with each other about things. I think we are at that point in this conversation here. And let's talk about panpsychism. So, Philip, you have become a very prominent advocate of panpsychism. Let's first of all explain what. So my sort of probably not very sophisticated notion of it is that consciousness is in everything in one degree or another. Is that kind of what panpsychism is?
Knocking my microphone over, getting too excited. Yeah, I suppose that the basic commitment is that it doesn't necessarily mean that literally everything is conscious. The basic commitment is the fundamental building blocks of reality, perhaps fundamental particles, perhaps universe-wide fields, have some kind of very, very rudimentary consciousness, and that human and animal consciousness somehow emerges from that.
Wait, let me see if I understand what you're saying. So you're saying trees have consciousness.
So it's
Rocks have consciousness.
No, not necessarily. So the fundamental building blocks, let's say for the sake of simplicity, fundamental particles like electrons and quarks. But a panpsychist needn't think that every random combination of particles is going to be conscious in its own right, like your socks and your rocks and stars and planets. I'd be inclined to think that there's only limited conditions in which conscious particles come together to form a system that's conscious in its own right. And we'd look to the kind of theories, empirical theories Ned was talking about earlier, to help us decide what those conditions are.
Why do you think there is consciousness in these, I guess what we would call, not brain-based entities?
Because we face a theoretic, and we cannot avoid this theoretical choice. Do we put the physical world first and try and get consciousness out of it? Do we put consciousness first, try and get the physical world out of it? Or do we take both? I think the first option, the materialist option, nobody has ever made the slightest bit of progress on its central explanatory task. No one's managed to at all explain how you're going to get consciousness out of purely physical processes. The second option, the panpsychist option, I think it has been shown how we can do it. The problem is essentially solved. And here I think this is the influence of Bertrand Russell, I think should be seen as the sort of Darwin of consciousness. Certain important work from the 1920s, I think he essentially showed how we can account for the physical world in terms of deeper underlying facts about mind or consciousness. So we've essentially got an answer there. Dualism, I think, is a coherent possibility, but as scientists and philosophers, we try and respect Occam's razor. Why believe in two kinds of things when you can believe in one? So I think that pushes us towards the first two options. So, materialism we've never made the slightest progress on, and I think there are good arguments that it's in some sense incoherent. Panpsychism is simpler than dualism, so that's the view we should go for.
Okay, Ned, I have to turn to you here. What's your take on panpsychism?
Look, I have to admit I don't know much about it, but I'm not sure what problem Philip said it solved. It sounded like he was saying it solved the hard problem, but as far as little I know about it, it just replaces the hard problem by another problem, which is how these little particles of consciousness combine to make a mind. So that seems to me to be equally hard. So look, I like a scientific approach. That's why I don't know much about panpsychism. I like the approach of trying to decide, for example, whether, say, a theory like the global workspace theory is right. And according to that theory, a conscious system could be realized by anything that has the right kind of global workspace.
Explain what you mean by global workspace.
The idea is it's a virtual space in which your perceptions are made available to these cognitive consuming systems. That would allow a machine to be conscious, for example. Or alternatively, maybe the biological approach is right, and that if that is right, then you can't have a conscious system that doesn't, say, have the electrochemical base that neurons have, where an electrical signal is translated into neurotransmitters going across a synaptic cleft and then translated back into electrical impulses. So that's a basic fact about the way all brains work. So is that basic? So I think that the scientific approach is to try to decide among these different options.
And you're saying that you need a brain to have consciousness?
I'm saying that's one option. I think the global workspace theory would say you don't need a brain to be conscious. It would say that you could have consciousness in a machine that has some, has a global workspace. So I think that look, I don't think any of these have shown promise for solving the hard problem. So I agree there is a hard problem, but I think the way to make progress is to figure out what consciousness is in us. And then once we can figure out what consciousness is in us, we can hope for some new ideas which might explain, get us a little closer to the hard problem. It may be that, like Rebecca says, it's not solvable.
I know.
but
I have an argument for it.
Okay. But, I think we have to try in any case.
Rebecca, what's your take on this?
Okay, so here's another reason why we may not have made any progress on the hard problem. We are the products of natural selection. There are certain capabilities we have and many capabilities we don't have. We can't fly, for example. Some animals can, we can't. We have a way of thinking. It's very tied in with language. It has to do with small parts, combinatorially combined, small set of rules, generates a lot of complexity. And so there's an isomorphism between our intellectual capacities and our linguistic capacities. And they are very much based on a kind of combinatorial atomism and a mapping onto other areas. And that's how we've made progress. That's how we make progress in physics. That's how we make progress in biology. That's how we make progress. That's how we think. There's nothing to say that this capacity, which I don't want to downplay, it's magnificent, we've gotten very far, is a capacity, it can understand everything. And I think that some of the hardcore philosophical problems, starting with the mind-body problem, are very good, and free will and the nature of the self and the a priori and the grounding of morality and epistemology. A good introductory course in philosophy might be a catalog of the problems that our wonderful brains are not particularly suited to be able to deal with.
Let me see if I understand.
Can I say something about this?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I think that is a powerful argument, but it is compatible with the idea that there's some other kind of intelligence that can understand the very things that we can't. And maybe we could even make a machine that could make a lot of progress in that regard. And if we do, maybe it could explain these things to us. Maybe there will be gaps, things we can't understand. But it doesn't mean that nothing can be said about how consciousness works that we could understand.
No, I agree with you, although I'm doubtful about machines.
Yeah, so wait,
Yeah.
I mean, you're just introducing the idea that maybe AI is going to explain consciousness to us.
And then it'll enslave us.
Philip, how is AI going to explain consciousness?
Yeah, well, just to pick up on the point, I mean, I also really like the science, but it's not either or. I think that the four theories Ned was talking about earlier, integrated information, global workspace, and so on, concern which kinds of brain activity go along with conscious experience, and that's a really important project. But we've also got the problem of why? Why do certain kinds of brain activity go along with conscious experience? And that brings us back to the mind-body problem. So I prefer now to say mind-body problem rather than the hard problem of consciousness. Sorry, Dave. Because, I think sometimes that suggests to people, Ned said, how does panpsychism help with the hard problem? That we've got to start with the physical world and how can we get consciousness out. I kind of agree with Rebecca, that's not solvable. But fortunately, there's another option. We can do it the other way around. We can start with consciousness, get the physical world out of that, and we know how to do that. So you've got two explanatory projects here, one of which no one's ever made progress on, one of which has already been completed. It's a no-brainer, really.
I really am surprised to hear you say that that's been completed. And it actually, I too have not. I used to be a panpsychist. I think I argued for it in my PhD dissertation. But it seemed to me that the problem of emergence emerges in panpsychism as well. And panpsychism, if it's anything, it's an attempt to avoid the problem of emergence.
Can you explain this? When you talk about emergence, what do you mean?
Well, there's strong emergence and weak emergence. Strong emergence, which is philosophically the interesting one, is if there is some phenomena that you simply can't derive out of the substrate, out of the stuff of at that level and the laws that it obeys, and it's just something just occurs, and it just can't be derived. Something new is on the horizon, and it seems to me, that giving this kind of consciousness, whatever it could possibly be, to electrons, neutrons, and positrons, and somehow we're going to get this consciousness that we know out of it. I mean, it seems the emergence problem emerges again, and it's just, I don't, I understand so well the instinct to do that because we're making so much progress on these other problems, but still, where does the consciousness? Why does it feel like something? So why don't we just put it right in, to matter itself? But there are real problems.
I think it's a very important point you're making, but what does end up being weakly emergent is the physical world. So maybe I could just fill in a tiny bit more detail of this Bertrand Russell-inspired view. So I think Russell was thinking really hard about what it means that our fundamental science is purely mathematical, right? That's really useful if you're a working scientist. You can get very precise predictions. But what does it mean as a philosopher interested in the ultimate nature of reality that our fundamental science is purely mathematical? And I think what that implies is that our fundamental science doesn't really tell us that much about the nature of ultimate reality. It merely describes it in terms of its mathematical structure. And so ultimate reality, could turn out to be anything. So long as it has the right mathematical structure, you can get physics out of that. So on the panpsychist view, the ultimate reality is constituted of networks of very simple conscious subjects interacting in simple, predictable ways, through their interactions realizing certain mathematical structures and patterns. And then the thought is those mathematical structures and patterns just are what we call physics. So you get physics out of these underlying facts about consciousness. So what is weakly emergent is the physical world. So rather than trying to get consciousness weakly emergent from the physical world, you get the physical world weakly emergent from consciousness. But Rebecca makes a fair point, and Ned made it earlier as well. Okay, how do you get our consciousness out of that? But I think that's only a concern if you're going for a very reductionist form of panpsychism, where you basically think, all there really are conscious particles, and then, the thing we call Ned's mind is just a complex collection of conscious particles. So some people are doing very interesting work on that kind of very reductionist panpsychism. Luke Roloff, who's in the audience somewhere, with the butterfly shirt. I'm less and less inclined to that kind of very reductionist proposal, and I don't think there's really any empirical or theoretical reason to do that. I think, nonetheless, there is still serious theoretical advantages here, because we end up with a very simple parsimonious view where all that exists are forms of consciousness, and we explicate the physical world in terms of that. So that seems to me still the most theoretically attractive option. We've got an intelligible story where the physical world is weakly emergent, and there don't seem to be any obvious gaps.
So I'm going to jump in here. I know that you both are going to want to respond to this, and we'll probably come back to this in a circuitous route, but I want to bring this conversation down to, I guess you might call, a more human level. These are very esoteric ideas that we're talking about. They might seem like, oh, maybe this is just the kind of stuff that philosophers talk about, does any of this matter? Does any of this matter in terms of how we think about our lives, in terms of how we construct our sense of meaning or purpose or our place in the world, how we conceptualize the nature of the mind-body problem or consciousness? Why should I care about this? Ned?
So, the kind of debates that I'm involved in really come down to the question of whether consciousness and cognition are different things. So, two of the four main theories of consciousness really assimilate consciousness to cognition. Basically, they're theories according to which consciousness is really a kind of thinking. I think it matters hugely to our self-conception.
What
If
about
we
animals? I mean, aren't they conscious?
But they're thinking too. The higher order thought theory says that that reduces the consciousness of animals to their higher order thoughts. And babies too. So my view is that it really makes a tremendous difference to how we think about ourselves if we think that we are basically thinking things, or if we think, on the other hand, that we are beings that both think and feel, and that those are equally important.
Okay. Rebecca, why does this matter?
Why does this matter? Well, one reason it matters is people seem to be afraid of death, right? They have a creaturely fear of death. And this question relates very much to whether it's even conceivable that we could survive our death. I mean,
Whether consciousness exists after our
right.
physical
I mean,
bodies
is
die.
this even in the realm? I said that one of the things that philosophers try to do is to take to map out the configuration space. What are the space of possibilities given what science is telling us? I mean, if you really do believe, as I do believe, and I think it's that consciousness is the brain, it's not in the realm of possibility.
So just to
that we
follow
could
up on that
survive. Yeah.
line of thinking, you're saying basically if you take the physicalist view that, the mind is what the brain does, you end up with atheism.
Even though we can't for the hell of us figure out how it does this, but nevertheless, I think we have pretty good evidence that it's the brain that's doing it. It just doesn't, it's not a possibility. And that makes a tremendous difference, a tremendous emotional difference to the way you live your life. I mean, meaning, purpose. There are, people who are striving to, their whole life is aimed toward a future state after their life, the afterlife, and, to get their just rewards, their just punishments, and to meet their loved ones. And I mean, it permeates my entire life that I don't believe that I believe that this life is the only life that I'm ever going to have, and the people that I love, I will not meet again. And I just can't think of anything that matters more to me.
Can I say something about that?
Mm-hmm.
One of the scientific ideas about consciousness is that it's basically an informational thing. And if that's true, then uploading your consciousness to a machine makes sense. And so that would really fit very well with Rebecca's idea.
I don't want it.
You don't want your
That's not the
consciousness
kind
uploaded.
of afterlife I want.
Whereas if that's false and we're all uploading our consciousness, we're turning ourselves into zombies and we don't realize it.
Exactly. So we do want to find out whether it's true or not.
I mean,
But this is fascinating.
Yes.
These issues that you were raising. I mean, because there are profound religious implications, right,
course
for
there
this.
are. Of course there
And Philip, I mentioned at the beginning that you were working on a book now that sort of explores this in between state between religious belief and atheism. And where do you come out on some of these issues?
Yeah, so this isn't just an abstract intellectual puzzle. I think consciousness is at the root of human identity. I think everything that matters in life comes from consciousness, from deep emotions, subtle thoughts, beautiful sensory experiences. as I'm inclined to think, controversially, but that our official scientific worldview, materialism, is actually incompatible with the existence of consciousness. And if that's right, we're at a very strange period of history where our official worldview is incompatible with the thing that is most evident and also the thing that gives life meaning and significance. So, and I think people feel that, and so I think that can lead to a deep sense of alienation, a sense that we don't fit into the world that science tells us about. So, ultimately we should be interested, not in the view we'd like to be true, but the view that's most likely to be true. The great thing about panpsychism is not only is it probably true, but I think it's slightly better for our mental and spiritual health, I think, because it can accommodate both the scientific truth, but also the things that give life meaning and significance.
So I'm going to ask the same question to each of you, but then I'm going to throw it to the audience here. So get ready for your questions. I want to bring this to a more personal level. I mean, all of you have been studying these issues, these ideas for years, for decades. At a personal level, at a daily level, how you conceptualize, how you go through the world, has this changed anything for you as you've dug into these issues? I mean, do you live any differently now? Ned?
Well, I'm certainly passionate about these issues, so maybe that's one way.
As a scholar, yes.
Yeah.
But any other way?
Not sure any other way.
Okay. Rebecca?
I'm awed by the fact that matter can do what it does. I'm simply awed that somehow or other matter, about which I agree with Philip, we have I think matter is tremendously mysterious. I think consciousness is mysterious. I think matter is also extremely mysterious.
What is mysterious about matter?
We don't, well, as Philip had said, we have our access into matter has come by way of mathematics. So we have this structural view of it, right? We understand matter in motion. Anything that we can describe in mathematical language, this is, all of our physical terms can be reduced to this, right? And, you have to know math in order to do physics. So that can't be the whole story of what matter is. So
coming back to, how does this affect you personally then?
Well, somehow matter does this, right? I mean, matter, which I was as an undergraduate, I majored in physics. And the physics is extraordinary and it's extremely exciting, but it can't tell you how matter manages this incredible feat of waking up to the world. It's not just in the world, but the world exists for it, right? And not to say that the world was created for it, but that there is, that there is a way for each conscious thing. There is a way that they are feeling about being in the world. They're awake to it. It's an incredible thing. The difference between matter that's conscious and matter that isn't conscious is an extraordinary difference. We can't explain it. And it has ethical implications. If in fact, these material objects have anything like consciousness, then we're abusing them, right? I mean, I would have to worry about sitting on this chair or all the other things that I do to material things. So it's just a huge difference between things that are conscious and things that aren't, and that somehow, some way, matter manages to do this. Just fills me with it first hit me when I was an undergraduate, when I was studying physics, that we have no idea how matter does this, and it has just filled me with awe ever since that somehow it does it.
I better turn to you, Philip. How does this affect your daily life?
Yeah, I think I've had quite a strange personal journey on these. I talk a little bit about it in my book, Galileo's Error. So when I was at university, we were taught the only two options were materialism or dualism, and I initially wanted to defend materialism, thought it was the scientifically credible option, eventually became persuaded that it's incompatible with the reality of conscious experience. So I decided I didn't have any conscious experience and, really tried to live that out. I think I managed about 3 months. And then, I just had this experience sitting in a bar with adrenaline, and just couldn't do it anymore, couldn't live in bad faith, couldn't deny my own conscious experience. And then after that, I didn't know, wasn't taught of any alternatives. I think after that I was a sort of closet dualist, just, keeping it to myself. And I wrote my end of undergraduate dissertation saying the problem was unsolvable, and went off and tried to do something else. Lived in Poland for a bit, tried to forget about it. Tried to read some science, the things that did make sense. Yeah, so, some people think because I'm into panpsychism, I like mystery. I hate mystery. I want to get rid of it. That's, But actually just coming across panpsychism and just think, oh my God, that kind of makes sense. That, preserves the scientific side of things and the evident reality of conscious experience in a quite simple, elegant way. And, the intellectual piece of finding a picture of the world that kind of makes sense and that you can kind of live in. And so I found about the only philosophy professor who was a panpsychist in those days, Galen Strawson, and did some graduate study, and it turned out okay, actually. So, yeah, so...
Okay, well, I am going to throw it to the audience now. We have two roving mics here, and I'm going to turn first to David Chalmers in the second row here, because he has been cited many times here for probably all of you. Foundational figure in our thinking about consciousness, the easy and hard problems. Now, Philip says you're a dualist. I didn't know there were any dualists left. Is that a correct explanation of your perspective, and where do you stand on the panpsychism issue?
Great. Well, thanks so much for this. It's great to hear perspectives from all three of these distinguished thinkers in the field. Interestingly, we have a materialist, panpsychist, Mysterian. Fair. It kind of sounds like a setup for a joke, right? A Mysterialist, a Mysterian, and a panpsychist walk into a bar. But I guess. I'm open-minded about all these issues, and I've got some sympathy with all of the views, and quite a lot of sympathy with Philip's panpsychism. But I'm most inclined towards the view that consciousness can't be explained in terms of anything more fundamental than consciousness. One possibility is that consciousness is present at the base of the physical world, as Philip thinks. But like Ned and like Rebecca, I do think that Philip's view faces a very serious problem of how does the basic consciousness combine to yield our consciousness. So the other alternative is that consciousness is fundamental but not present at the basic level of reality. It emerges at a higher level, and at a certain level, some systems are conscious and some are not. This, I think, you basically end up with a view where, I think this is where you will get to by following the science in the way that Ned wants to follow the science, that is, connect up, do studies of the brain and do studies of consciousness, and find the simplest connecting principles that connect the brain with consciousness. And Ned mentioned some biological theories like the global workspace theory, integrated information theory. No one thinks, though, those are the last word. Those are just a very, very prior word. My hope is that if you actually keep going with those, we'll find fundamental laws of nature that underlie, say, the global workspace theory or the integrated information theory or whatever the theory is, that we can then say it's a fundamental law of nature that when you have a system of a certain kind, you get consciousness.
You're saying that we have got to find that more fundamental law of nature.
Basically, my most fervent view here is it's very early days. in the science of consciousness. And probably any view that we now have is probably going to be wrong. And I've got my speculation about what might be the truth. Each of these thinkers have their speculation about what might be the truth. I guess I'm interested in the question of, since we're all going to be proved wrong eventually, probably, what kind of thing do you think is actually likely or has the potential to prove your view wrong?
No.
Look, I agree with a lot of what Dave says. I think the most basic point is that there are ideas missing here. You know, my hope is that by doing the science of consciousness, those ideas will develop. But I don't think anybody can suppose that what we've got so far is what we're going to end up with.
Rebecca, how might you be shown to be wrong?
If they do it.
If the scientists do it?
Yeah, I mean, if these new laws of nature emerge, you know, that would be very interesting and convincing. Yes.
So, in other words, that would you would no longer be a Mysterian.
Exactly.
Okay, because there would be
I would give up
explanation.
my view of the limitations of the human mind.
Philip, what would prove you to be wrong?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I'm sounding, more certain than I take myself to be. I'm actually, I'm sympathetic with what Dave is saying, that consciousness can't be explained in terms of anything more fundamental than consciousness. The problem with that dualist view is that you end up with two kinds of thing. It seems to me, all things being equal, it's better to have one kind of thing rather than two kinds of thing. Now, who knows? We don't know. Maybe the world is more complicated than our simplest hypothesis. But all you can ever do is work with the evidence we currently have, given our limited situation. And what we've always done in science and philosophy is just try and work out the simplest, most intelligible theory that's compatible with what we know. So, yeah, I feel confident that the view I have is the simplest theory compatible with what we know. But that makes me think, 0.6% credence, 60% rather than who knows. But yeah, all you can ever do is work with the evidence we currently have. Very good philosopher in my tradition, Miri al-Bahari, an analytic philosopher who is defending a Advaita Vedanta-inspired mystical hypothesis of the universe based on the testimony of expert meditators in the Eastern tradition. It's quite interesting, but she defends it in the kind of analytic language of our philosophical tradition in a very rigorous way. So, yeah, I'm open to that possibility that there could be certain truths about the ultimate nature of reality that are revealed in certain higher states of consciousness. Just depends what we're trying to do here. I guess I'm addressing a different theoretical question of how consciousness just per se fits with the physical world. So I think, yeah, there may be different issues here, but both important.
So the question is, how do we differentiate different kinds of consciousness? Who has it? Human versus various animals, mammals. We could go, birds, other kinds of animals, machines. How do we assess whether any of those have consciousness?
Well, I had a hypothesis when I was a graduate student that many philosophers of mind were actually automata, and that they didn't have consciousness. So, basically, the problem of other minds exists for other people as well. We only directly are confronted with our own consciousness. However, we see people behaving in certain ways, and really, the inference to the best explanation is that they've got brains like I have a brain, and that they're behaving, when they sit on a thumbtack the way I behave when I sit on a thumbtack. And animals too, right? I mean, do we really have any doubt that animals, I mean, maybe oysters, I've got some questions about, but, yeah, mammals, do we really, or birds, or fish, and it makes a huge difference. Some of us make our dietary choices based on the belief that animals at least feel pain. And there's good evolutionary explanation for this as well. So, it seems to me that, animals, and as Ned said, once consciousness began to, experimenters began to experiment on animals, we learned a tremendous amount. The question of machines, we'll see. We'll see what transpires, but it might someday face us, the ethical question of robot rights. Consciousness has also, ethical implications.
Can I just follow up on that? And because Ned, you brought up this question of machine consciousness in the future. It sounds like you've thought about this. I mean, what would be your speculation of how we might know that there is sophisticated AI consciousness?
I'd rather answer a question about animals.
Okay.
So we discovered lots of phenomena about human consciousness, and they tend to be replicated in monkeys. So, for example, if we see a clockwise moving object and focus on it for 30 seconds, we'll have an afterimage moving in the opposite direction. The same is true of monkeys. All kinds of phenomena involving, our conscious experience we find in higher primates. So we have a really good reason to think that their visual systems work very much like ours.
I'm going to make a little plug for our next event in this series. In January, we are going to really dive into this question of, do animals have consciousness, and if so, what kind? So anyway, you should come back in January for that. So.
Look, there are all kinds of brain damage that cause change in consciousness. Probably the most dramatic is blind sight, where you have a destruction of the earliest visual areas, which, as it happens, are in the back of the head. And then, people lose conscious vision in the destroyed part, but they appear to have some other kind of unconscious vision. But there's all kinds of work on it's called sort of neuropsychology of the changed consciousness of brain damaged people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge area of finding out about what the various parts of the brain do, is studying people who have been brain damaged. Another very dramatic example is people whose corpus callosum has been severed. I think of that was used to be a treatment for epilepsy, and so the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere are not communicating with each other, and you can get incredibly interesting and dramatic results out of it, as if there are really just two different minds in there. And there's just a host of stuff. Antonio Damasio's books on what happens when the amygdala is so the seat of the emotions is damaged, and interestingly, you wouldn't think so. It goes totally against Plato's theory of the tripartite soul, but people who no longer have these emotions can't make decisions. They're really kind of stymied. And so, I mean, a tremendous amount of research that's really fascinating.
I actually have an undergraduate student writing a dissertation on this at the moment, looking at number of scientific papers on defending cell consciousness. And well, I mean, of course, I think it starts earlier than that, at the level of fundamental particles or fields, if you prefer those in your ontology. But it's an open, ongoing empirical question at higher levels where you get consciousness, the kind of theories Ned was talking about. I'm myself sympathetic to the integrated information theory, actually for various philosophical reasons, but that would tend to put consciousness lower down than other theories, potentially at the cellular level, depending. But yeah, I think it's an ongoing question where consciousness is.
We have time for one final question. Let's go to the gentleman.
Maybe we should let that be the last word.
I like that, yes. Yes.
Any follow-ups there? Okay, I think that is the last word. Thank you.